He was halfway through a conference call when his assistant's voice cracked through the intercom. "Sir, you'll want to come downstairs." Corwin Hale, billionaire CEO and master of control, rarely left a meeting for anyone. But something in her tone, tight, uneasy, made him pause. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. As the doors opened to the marble foyer, he stopped cold. She stood there, the nanny, but not in her usual uniform. Today, she wore a plain gray coat, eyes lowered, and on either side of her stood 2 children, a boy and a girl, no older than 4, clutching her hands like lifelines. Both had dark, stormy eyes. His eyes. Mireille lifted her head slowly and met his stare with quiet resolve. "They're yours," she said softly. Silence, long and heavy. Corwin's breath caught. His voice, always sharp, barely escaped his throat. "You lied." Mireille's hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "No, I protected them. From you." He staggered back a step, as if her words struck something he didn't know could break. God help every woman watching this video to know her strength, especially when silence is mistaken for weakness. And may every child be covered, even when the world seems cold. Before we go deeper into how this powerful CEO's world began to fall apart, if you believe in truth, grace, or second chances, like this video and subscribe to Mr. Ross' Story Trail. Corwin didn't speak. His eyes moved from the girl's curls to the boy's hands, small, clenched, and trembling slightly. They weren't dressed in designer clothes or carrying little monogrammed backpacks. They wore second-hand jackets and mismatched mittens. Simple, human, real. He looked at Mireille again, the woman he'd mocked, who had walked through his home each day with quiet steps, invisible in the way only people trained to stay out of sight can be. How long had she carried this truth? How many times had he passed her in the hallway, unaware that his own children's mother was standing inches away? He swallowed hard. His voice, when it finally returned, was dry. "Why now?" "Because life doesn't wait for pride to make room," she said, "and because I couldn't keep pretending they didn't have a father, even if you chose not to be one." She was calm. No bitterness. No begging. Just truth. It was Corwin's world that shook, not hers. The man who had controlled boardrooms, dominated city skylines, and walked through fire to build. His empire now stood wordless in his own home, undone by the smallest faces he had never known. The girl blinked up at him. The boy hid behind Mireille's coat. Corwin took a slow breath. Somewhere deep inside, something cracked. Not loudly, but unmistakably. In the distance, the front door closed. Corwin hadn't noticed Mireille's friend quietly departing after dropping her off. All he could focus on were the 2 small lives now sitting on the edge of his carefully curated world. They didn't know who he was, not really, but they stared with eyes that looked too much like his own to deny, and he didn't know what to do with that. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, words weren't currency. Power didn't mean anything. The silence wasn't hers to break anymore. It was his. A memory flickered, something blurred from years ago. Tuscany, a stormy night, a woman with steady hands, a warmth that had once held his grief, even when he had nothing left to give. Was it her? Of course it was. He hadn't forgotten. He just buried it, like he did with most things that made him feel too much. "Would you like to sit down?" Mireille asked, her voice even. Kind, almost, but not soft enough to suggest forgiveness. He nodded. Slowly, the twins glanced up at him, unsure, curious. One moment of arrogance had brought this woman into his home. But she hadn't come alone. She brought the truth with her. And truth, no matter how long it waits, always finds its way to the surface. Corwin Hale ruled his world from the top floor of Hale Dominion Tower, 68 stories, above Manhattan, where even the noise of the city seemed to bow beneath him. From his office window, the skyline stretched endlessly, a jagged crown of steel and ambition. He liked it that way. Distance kept people in their place. Height made him untouchable. At least, that's what he told himself. His assistant moved through the office with quiet precision, placing a folder on his desk. "Morning briefing, sir." He nodded without looking up. He didn't need to. He trusted efficiency, not connection. Numbers, contracts, projections, those were controllable. Human emotion wasn't. Corwin flipped through the documents, signing page after page with calm authority. His empire thrived on discipline. Investors admired him. Developers feared disappointing him. Competitors tried to emulate him. He walked through life with the certainty of a man who had built everything with his own hands. Yet beneath that armor was a constant, silent ache, one he never acknowledged out loud. 5 years hadn't softened the loss of Leora. The world believed he'd recovered because he worked harder. Truthfully, he worked harder because he hadn't recovered. The day she stopped breathing, something inside him froze. He promised himself he would never feel that exposed again. So he didn't. He outgrew friendships. He limited family visits. He loved no one, trusted no one, and let no one close enough to touch the place where pain still lived. It was easier that way, or so he thought. By mid-afternoon, his sister Ilaria stormed into his office with all the subtlety of a gust of wind. She never waited for permission to enter, something that irritated him, yet deep down reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. "You ignored my messages," she announced, folding her arms. "I was in meetings," he replied, not looking up from his screen. "That's always your excuse." He typed for another moment before sighing and finally meeting her eyes. "What is it now?" Ilaria dropped onto the leather chair across from him, her expression equal parts frustration and affection. She adored her big brother, but she never hesitated to challenge him. "It's Luca," she said. Corwin stiffened. "What about him?" "He idolizes you," she replied. "But he never sees you. I'm asking you again, please spend some time with him. Just a few weeks. He needs a steady presence while I finish this project overseas." "I am busy, Ilaria." "You're always busy," she shot back. "I'm not asking you to climb a mountain. I'm asking you to show up for the only child who looks at you like you hung the moon." Corwin didn't flinch, but something flickered in his eyes, an emotion he quickly suppressed. "And before you say it," she added, "you won't be the one caring for him. You can hire someone, a nanny, a temporary live-in arrangement, just until I return." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "I don't like people in my space." "People or feelings?" she asked softly. His jaw tightened. Ilaria lowered her voice. "Corwin, he's family. You can't keep everyone at arm's length forever. The world you built is impressive, but it's not everything." He hated when she did this, when she slipped past his defenses with the ease of someone who remembered him before the empire, before the loss, before he turned cold to survive. "I'll consider it," he said finally. Her face softened. "Thank you." She stood, smoothing her blazer. "I'll send over the agency options tonight, and Corwin." She paused at the door. "Don't just consider it. Try." He didn't answer. After she left, quiet settled into the room again. But it wasn't the comfortable kind he relied on. This silence pressed in, reminding him of nights when an empty penthouse felt larger than any skyscraper. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. A nanny, a stranger living under his roof. The idea made his skin tighten. Yet he couldn't deny the truth. Luca deserved more than polite excuses. Corwin exhaled, resigned. "Fine," he murmured to himself. "We'll make it work." That evening, his penthouse was bathed in warm lighting, minimalist, polished, and immaculate. Everything had its place. Everything was controlled. He sat with Ilaria's email open on his tablet, scrolling through profiles. Each candidate came with sparkling reviews and long lists of certifications, but he skimmed them with disinterest. His nephew was sweet, calm, easy to care for. He didn't need a miracle worker. He needed stability. One applicant caught his attention, not because of her resume, but because it was shorter than the rest. No glamour, no carefully framed photo, just a simple headshot and a description that read, Mireille, experienced caretaker, calm disposition, fluent in multiple languages, prior work with children ages 2 to 6, no last name listed, no attempt to impress. For reasons he couldn't explain, he paused. Something about her gaze in the photo felt steady, almost familiar. He shook the thought away. Familiarity didn't matter. He wasn't looking for a connection. He was looking for competence. He texted his assistant, schedule interview, Mireille Agency 14th. A moment later, the reply buzzed, confirmed, for tomorrow morning. He closed the tablet. Decision made. Problem solved. Controlled. Yet as he prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the image of her eyes. Dark, calm, almost knowing. He didn't recognize her, of course. He would have remembered, wouldn't he? The next morning, Corwin dressed in his usual uniform, charcoal suit, crisp shirt, no tie. Clean angles. No warmth. A man built to command. He stepped into the private dining room expecting silence, but found his nephew sitting at the long table, swinging his feet. Luca's smile lit up the room instantly. "Uncle Cor," the boy exclaimed, hopping down and running to him. Corwin caught him mid-jump, awkwardly but with surprising steadiness. "You're up early." Ilaria said, "I'm staying with you. Are we gonna have fun?" Fun. The word felt foreign on his tongue. "We'll do something," he replied. Luca laughed, unbothered by vagueness. Children had an uncanny ability to accept even the smallest gestures as affection. The boy sat again, eating cereal shaped like tiny stars. Corwin watched him for a moment, really watched him. The innocence, the trust, the natural ease he hadn't felt in years. A strange tug pulled at Corwin's chest, something close to longing, but softer. His assistant entered the room. "Sir, your 9 o'clock interview is here." He nodded. "Bring her to the South Lounge." As she left, he turned back to Luca. "Finish your breakfast. I'll be back soon." "Okay," the boy replied, mouth full. Corwin forced his thoughts into order as he walked down the hall. The interview would be simple, quick, professional. A nanny was just a staff member, a temporary necessity, nothing more. He reached the lounge, straightened his cuffs, and waited as footsteps approached. The door opened, and Mireille stepped inside, not yet knowing that within months, her presence would break open everything he had spent years trying to hold together. But for now, she greeted him with quiet dignity. "Good morning, Mr. Hale." He felt an odd stillness. "Sit," he said, and the world he thought he controlled shifted, just slightly, without him realizing. "Have you ever met someone who hides pain behind power? Let us know in the comments." Mireille sat without hesitation, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't smile to impress. She met Corwin's stare directly, not challengingly, but with the calm of someone who had long made peace with silence. He hated that he couldn't read her. People usually folded under his gaze. She didn't flinch. "You've worked with children before," he began, scanning her profile. "Yes," she replied. "For over 6 years. Why did you leave your last position?" "The family relocated. I preferred to stay in New York." Her voice carried a soft accent, hard to place but familiar in a way that tugged at something buried. "Do you have any certifications?" he asked. "Yes, they're included in the file. CPR, early learning development, multilingual immersion. You're fluent in French?" "I am." He nodded, not betraying the memory that threatened to rise, the faint sound of someone once, whispering in French beside him, long ago, when grief had pressed into his chest like concrete. But that night was lost in time. He straightened. "We keep a structured routine in this house. No disruptions. I expect efficiency." "I understand. No loud guests. No personal calls during hours. You'll have a separate living space on the 3rd floor, meals provided, and access to our schedule." "I've worked with more demanding households," she replied, without any edge. Her answer surprised him. Not because of what she said, but how she said it. No resentment. No attempt to charm. Just calm clarity. He stood. "You'll start tomorrow. My nephew arrives this evening." She stood as well. "I'll be ready." As she left, Corwin watched her walk away with poise. No glancing back, no eagerness. She didn't need to prove anything. He didn't know why that unsettled him more than it should. That night, Mireille settled into her room quietly. The space was more luxurious than necessary, a private suite with a view of the skyline. But she didn't linger on the aesthetics. She unpacked carefully, setting down 2 framed photos beside her bed. In one, a boy holding a toy truck. In the other, a girl with a braid too big for her small head. She touched each frame gently, then placed a small notebook beneath her pillow. Tomorrow, she would see him again, and he still wouldn't know. Luca arrived just before dusk, dragging a rolling suitcase behind him and beaming with excitement. Corwin greeted him at the door, awkward but present. Ilaria kissed her son's forehead, gave Corwin a firm hug, and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, unsure of how to respond. Once she left, Luca explored the apartment like it was a fortress. "Do you have a secret room?" he asked. "No," Corwin replied. "Can we build one?" He almost smiled. "We'll see." A soft knock interrupted their moment. Mireille entered, dressed in a soft cream blouse and slacks. She offered a small wave, Hello, Luca. The boy stared for a moment, then smiled. Are you my nanny? Yes. You talk pretty, he said. Like stories. Mireille crouched to his level. Do you like stories? I love them. Then we'll get along just fine. Corwin watched the exchange with a guarded expression. She hadn't bent to charm him, but her voice softened instantly for Luca. She seemed to shift without effort. He didn't like not understanding her. Over the next week, Mireille moved like quiet wind through the apartment. She didn't linger where she wasn't needed. She wasn't intrusive. Yet somehow, she was always where she was supposed to be. Luca adored her. The two of them shared morning routines, mid-afternoon story hours, and whispered jokes before bedtime. Corwin began to notice things. Subtle things. The way Luca now hummed as he played alone. The way the boy no longer waited outside Corwin's office door, unsure of how to ask for attention. The way the apartment, once sterile and composed, felt a degree warmer, not from any changes in design, but from presence. Still, Corwin kept his distance, until one evening, after a long meeting, he returned home to find Mireille, and Luca on the floor in the library, surrounded by blocks and books. Uncle Cor, Luca called out, waving a plastic figure. We built a castle. Mireille stood and dusted her skirt lightly. It's a story castle, with trapdoors. Corwin raised an eyebrow. Trapdoors? Every good story has them, she replied. Moments when things shift beneath your feet. He didn't reply, but something about that line lingered with him. He turned to Luca. Time for bed. Go wash up. Once the boy skipped off, Corwin glanced back at Mireille. You've settled in. I try not to disrupt. You haven't. He paused. You're good with him. She met his eyes. Children see what adults forget. They respond to what's real. Corwin studied her for a moment. What do you think they see in me? She didn't flinch. That depends on what you let them. That night, Corwin didn't sleep easily. 2 weeks passed. Mireille remained a mystery. Not distant, but deliberate. She rarely spoke, unless spoken to. She never overstepped. She did her job with quiet precision, and yet, Corwin found himself noticing her more than necessary. The way she moved when she thought no one was watching. The way she spoke French softly into her phone on breaks. The way her eyes sometimes carried something deeper than exhaustion, something closer to endurance. He couldn't name it, and he hated that he cared enough to try. One afternoon, as he returned from a board meeting, he heard laughter in the distance, real, unfiltered laughter. His nephew and Mireille were in the kitchen, baking cookies. Luca had flour on his cheeks. Mireille wore an apron far too elegant for the task. Yet she laughed as Luca spilled sugar, chasing the grains like tiny stars across the counter. Corwin stood in the doorway longer than he meant to. She noticed. He stepped back before she could say anything, retreating to his office. Alone again, but not untouched. Corwin was not a man who second-guessed himself. Decisions were made quickly, cleanly. Emotions were set aside, filed into places he rarely reopened. But since Mireille's arrival, he had started noticing himself thinking in ways he hadn't in years, replaying moments, questioning his tone, watching her across the room without quite knowing why. It frustrated him. She wasn't beautiful in the loud, curated way that filled his world, models, influencers, polished smiles. Her beauty was quieter. She didn't wear designer labels or linger for attention. Her clothes were modest, her eyes, unbothered by opinions. She didn't shrink under his presence, and she didn't chase it either. That balance disarmed him more than flattery ever could. One morning, he entered the breakfast room earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen. To his surprise, Mireille was already there, packing lunch containers for Luca. She glanced up. Good morning. He poured coffee. You're early. I'm always up before 6. Personal discipline? Children wake with the day, she said, smiling faintly. If you wait for quiet, you miss everything. He sipped his coffee. You speak like someone who's done this before. Often. I've cared for many children. He noted her choice of words, not raised, cared for. You don't have children of your own? He asked. Mireille's hand paused briefly over a lunchbox lid. It was subtle, barely noticeable. No, she said calmly. But Corwin, for the first time, wondered if that was the whole truth. He didn't push. Later that afternoon, Ilaria called to check on Luca. He's glowing, she said. I knew he'd love her. Corwin kept his voice measured. She's efficient. She's warm, Corwin, Ilaria corrected. And he needs that more than you realize. There was a pause. You know what else he needs? She added gently. You. I'm here. Physically, yes, but you've built your world like a fortress. I worry sometimes that you've locked yourself out too. He didn't respond. Ilaria sighed. You're not just his uncle. You're his chance to believe that strong men can be present ones too. After the call ended, Corwin stared out the window for a long time. That weekend, Mireille took Luca to the park. Corwin joined them, not because he planned to, but because he couldn't. Explain why the idea of staying inside alone felt heavier than usual. He sat on a bench as Luca climbed the jungle gym. Mireille stood nearby, her gaze steady on the boy. You don't speak much about yourself, Corwin said, without looking at her. I wasn't aware it was required, she answered softly. He turned toward her. It's not. I'm just curious. She looked at him then. Not sharply, but with a quiet intensity that made him sit straighter. Curiosity doesn't always come from kindness, she said. Sometimes it comes from control. He blinked. I'm not here to challenge you, Mr. Hale, or flatter you. I'm here for Luca. He nodded slowly. Do you ever wonder, she asked, why silence makes you uncomfortable? He didn't answer. Because she was right. And it did. A few nights later, Corwin walked past the guest wing and noticed Mireille's door slightly open. He was about to close it when he heard her speaking in a gentle voice, not to him, not to anyone nearby, but over the phone. You brushed your teeth? She asked, in French. A pause. Good. I'm proud of you. You too, my sweet. I miss you both. Another pause. Her voice lowered. Sleep well, Miss Trésor. Maman loves you. Corwin froze. Maman. His breath caught. Mireille didn't notice him outside. She ended the call, then sat on the edge of her bed, still for a long moment. Corwin stepped back quietly. He didn't sleep that night. He lay awake thinking about her hands, the way she packed lunches, the lines beneath, her eyes, and the quiet sadness that had always been there. Only now it had a shape. And that one word, mother. The following morning, he said nothing. He greeted her as usual. She replied as usual. But nothing felt usual anymore. By the end of the third week, Luca had become bolder, happier. He told jokes at dinner. He asked Corwin questions. He left drawings outside his office door, each one signed Luca and M. Corwin pinned them on the inside of his closet door where no one could see. One evening, Luca fell asleep on the couch during a movie. Corwin moved to lift him, but Mireille gently stepped in. I've got him, she said softly, scooping the boy into her arms with practiced ease. Corwin watched as she carried Luca down the hall, the boy's head resting naturally against her shoulder, arms curled around her neck like they'd done it 100 times before. Because they had. He just didn't know it yet. Later that night, as he poured himself a glass of whiskey, Corwin caught his reflection in the window. He didn't recognize the version of himself who lingered in rooms just to hear her voice, who stepped into family movie nights, who felt more unsettled by her silence than by confrontation. Power had always given him clarity, but Mireille had given him something else, a mirror, one he hadn't wanted but couldn't look away from. And still, he had no idea who she really was, not yet. But soon he'd find out, and when he did, the mirror would crack. The morning sun had barely cleared the skyline when Mireille arrived at the apartment in a simple navy coat and a bag tucked close to her side. She moved with measured steps, neither hurried nor hesitant, as if the air itself couldn't push her faster than she intended to go. Corwin was already in the main lounge, going over Luca's schedule with his assistant. The boy was finishing cereal nearby, swinging his feet under the table. The mood was calm, efficient, until Corwin glanced up. His gaze scanned Mireille from head to toe in a fraction of a second. She wore no makeup. Her blouse was soft blue, sleeves rolled with quiet precision. Her skirt, modest. Her shoes, worn at the edges but clean. He didn't hide his reaction. He leaned slightly toward his assistant, voice low, but not low enough. Is this what premium looks like these days? Mireille heard it. So did the assistant, who stiffened and avoided her eyes. Mireille said nothing. She stood in place, chin steady, not blinking. Corwin continued speaking as though nothing had happened. Luca's piano lesson is on Thursdays. He eats only one kind of yogurt and refuses the others, so don't waste time negotiating. He hates when people walk into his room unannounced. No cartoons before dinner. He tends to talk too much, don't indulge it. He tossed a paper onto the table. That's the housekeeping schedule. Stick to it. Still, Mireille said nothing. She took the paper, glanced over it once, and gave a small nod. I'll memorize it. Her voice was calm even. Corwin narrowed his eyes, slightly thrown. You'll memorize it? Yes. Noted, he replied, sharp. He didn't like being surprised, especially not by a woman who carried herself like her presence didn't need permission. Later that day, Mireille took Luca to the botanical garden just a few blocks away. She packed snacks, extra tissues, and a tiny camera he loved to use. He chattered endlessly as they walked, pointing out buses, birds, and trees. She listened the way few adults did, not to correct or reply, but to hear. By the time they returned, the boy was glowing with joy and exhaustion. Corwin looked up from his laptop as they entered. You were gone longer than scheduled, he said. There was traffic, she replied simply, removing Luca's coat. I see. He said nothing more, but the silence wasn't neutral. It carried the weight of judgment left unspoken. Mireille continued without reacting. That evening, as she prepared Luca's bath, Corwin passed by and noticed something that made him pause. She was singing, softly, in French. The melody was faint, low, but haunting in its beauty. Luca was humming along in his own rhythm. Corwin lingered outside the door. There was something in that tune, familiar, like an echo he couldn't quite place. A sound from a distant night, a villa, a bottle of wine untouched, a silence heavier than grief. A woman who sat beside him and said nothing because words had no place in that kind of sorrow. A night he had forgotten, or tried to. He stepped away from the door quickly, annoyed at himself for lingering, for remembering. It was coincidence, he told himself. Nothing more. The next day, Corwin joined Luca and Mireille at breakfast. The boy was drawing a dragon with purple wings and describing its lava breath. Mireille listened, her hand lightly resting near his elbow to steady the page. Corwin watched her silently. Where did you learn French? He asked abruptly. Mireille glanced at him, unbothered. France and Senegal. My mother was from Marseille. My father lived in Dakar. He nodded slowly. You've traveled. I have. For work, for survival, she said gently. And then for meaning. The honesty in her voice made him uncomfortable, not because it was emotional, but because it was without filter. No performative polish, no apology. He changed the subject. Over the coming days, Corwin tried to keep things distant and professional. But Mireille's presence unsettled the routines he once found comfort in. She wasn't intrusive. She didn't challenge him. She didn't try to impress. And somehow, that made her unforgettable. There was something about the way she moved through the space, graceful without drawing attention, purposeful without rushing. She folded Luca's clothes with care. She made simple meals that tasted like comfort. She read bedtime stories in both English and French, and when Luca drifted off, she lingered just long enough to be sure he was safe. Corwin observed it all quietly. He couldn't explain why he noticed, but he did. He noticed everything. One night, he returned home later than usual. A contract negotiation had gone poorly, and he was already irritable when he entered the apartment. He found Mireille in the kitchen, arranging food on a tray. Luca was already asleep. Corwin poured a drink. Do you always sing in French? He asked, not looking at her. Only to children, she replied. Why not in English? Some things sound softer in other languages. There was a beat of silence. Corwin turned to her. Have we met before? Mireille's eyes didn't waver. Should we have? I feel like I've heard your voice before. She gave a small, unreadable smile. Perhaps in a dream. He studied her. You're not easy to read. I don't need to be read, Mr. Hale. I just need to do my job. Her words should have stung. But they didn't. They landed softly, like a hand pressed gently against a wound, not to aggravate, but to acknowledge. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a memory surfaced with sharp clarity. Tuscany, the stone balcony, the way the wind had carried the scent of rosemary from the garden below, the sound of footsteps behind him that didn't ask for attention, but offered presence. He had cried that night. not loudly, but openly, and the only witness to his grief was a woman who held no clipboard, made no promises, and said nothing except, "You are allowed to break, sir." The voice, it was hers. Now he was sure. But why hadn't she said anything? Why would she come back? And why, of all people, would she choose to care for his nephew? Unless... He sat up abruptly. No, that would be impossible, wouldn't it? Mireille moved through the apartment as if she'd always belonged there. She didn't need to raise her voice or fill the space to be noticed. Her presence was felt in the steadiness of routines, the warmth in Luca's laughter, and the quiet understanding she carried like second skin. Corwin noticed, more than he wanted to. One evening, while reviewing development blueprints in his study, he heard light footsteps approaching. Mireille appeared in the doorway, her expression composed. "I'm heading out to the pharmacy. Luca has a mild cough. I'll return shortly." He nodded. "Do you need the driver?" "No," she replied. "I prefer to walk." "Suit yourself." She turned to leave, but paused. "Would you like anything while I'm out?" The question startled him, not because of its content, but because no one had asked him something that simple in a very long time. "No," he said, after a pause. "Thank you." She left with the soft click of the door behind her. Corwin stared at the space she'd just vacated. Something about her rhythm was disarming. She didn't push. She didn't avoid. She simply existed with grace he couldn't name. And it irritated him. The next day, Corwin entered the kitchen and found Mireille reading at the counter, while a pot simmered behind her. The smell was familiar: rosemary, tomatoes, garlic, something that tugged at his memory like an old, half-forgotten song. He didn't comment. She glanced up. "You're early." "Not really." She closed the book and set it aside. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. He nodded. A beat passed. "What were you reading?" She hesitated, then handed it to him. He glanced at the cover. It was a journal. Handwritten. "You write?" "Sometimes. Thoughts, lessons, moments I don't want to forget." "Why not just forget them?" "Because they shape you," she said gently. "Even the ones you'd rather erase." He set the journal down. "I don't need reminders." "No," she replied, eyes clear. "You prefer silence." Corwin looked at her, expression unreadable. "You always speak like you know me," he said. "I don't," she answered. "But I know grief, and I know what silence becomes when it grows too long." Their eyes met across the space. He was the first to look away. Later that week, Luca came down with a fever. Mireille tended to him through the night, wiping his forehead with cool cloths, sitting beside his bed for hours. Corwin checked in once, just once. She didn't ask for help. She didn't need to. The next morning, Luca's fever had broken. He slept peacefully, arms sprawled across the bed. Corwin stood in the doorway, watching as Mireille adjusted the covers. "You've done this before," he said quietly. She didn't turn around. "Yes. You're not new to any of this." "No." He stepped inside. "You're more than a nanny." She faced him. "Titles mean little, Mr. Hale. Care is not a role, it's a choice." He nodded slowly. There was silence between them. Not cold, not hostile, just heavy. That evening, Corwin stood in his bedroom, pulling an old box from his closet. He hadn't opened it in years. Inside were scattered remnants of another life: a bracelet, a postcard, a photograph of Leora laughing on a balcony in the sun. And beneath it, a journal. His. He flipped through the pages. Most of them were dated around the time of Leora's death. The entries were raw, anguished. One caught his eye. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. Just sat next to me like my pain wasn't something to be fixed, just something she could hold. His chest tightened. He read on. Her name was Mireille. I never asked for her last name. She didn't offer it, just said, "Sometimes presence is louder than comfort." He closed the book and stared at the wall. It was her. It had been her all along. The next morning, Corwin arrived late to breakfast. Mireille was pouring juice. She looked up. He studied her in a way that felt different. "You worked in Tuscany," he said. Her hands didn't shake, but her eyes darkened. "Yes," she said. "You were there the night I—" He stopped himself, swallowed. "That night, I was. Why didn't you tell me?" "You weren't the same man," she replied. "You were drowning." I was just someone nearby. But you came back. She nodded. I needed work. That's not the full truth. No, she agreed. It's not. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was waiting. Corwin didn't press. He wasn't ready to ask the real question forming inside him, and she wasn't ready to answer it. Not yet. That night, he sat alone in his office, lights low, drink untouched. He thought of how quick he'd been to mock her that first morning. Her blouse, her shoes, her quiet. How quickly he had labeled her small, temporary, unimpressive. And yet, here she was, unshaken. She didn't ask to be seen. But now he couldn't unsee her, and he wasn't sure what scared him more, the truth about her past, or the truth she reflected about him 5 years earlier. Tuscany, Italy. The villa stood in silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind, not the kind that came from rest or solitude. This was the kind of silence that followed after something had been broken, and everyone had stopped pretending they could fix it. Corwin Hale had arrived 2 days earlier, alone. He hadn't brought assistants. No team, no fiancé, just a black duffel bag and a face that looked carved from something harder than stone. The villa staff moved around him cautiously. They cooked, cleaned, delivered whatever he requested, which wasn't much: black coffee, whiskey, and silence. Mireille Ancel had arrived the morning before, filling in for another staff member who'd fallen ill. She hadn't been briefed on the guest's story, just that he was American grieving and wealthy. That was enough. She hadn't seen him up close until that night. It was nearly midnight when she stepped onto the stone balcony overlooking the vineyard, hoping for air. She didn't expect anyone to be there, but he was, sitting on the edge of the low wall, a glass dangling from his fingers, his shirt open at the collar, eyes red-rimmed and wild with exhaustion. He didn't notice her at first. When he did, he didn't move. He looked like a man lost in something he couldn't climb out of. I didn't mean to intrude, she said softly. You didn't. He stared into the dark hills. I was told this place had peace, he muttered. She didn't reply. He took a sip. But it's quiet, too quiet. Can't hear anything but your own thoughts, and those are loud. He glanced sideways at her. You ever lose someone and wonder how the world keeps spinning like nothing happened? She stepped closer, not too close, but enough to hear him clearly. Yes. His eyes studied her face, unsure whether to believe her. You. She nodded. My sister. Years ago. Was it quick? Too quick to say goodbye. Too slow to forget. That answer settled something in him. He looked away. I wasn't there when she died, he whispered. I was closing a deal. Thought I had time. I always think I have time. Mireille said nothing. She didn't offer sympathy. She didn't offer advice. She just stood beside him, the way one stands beside someone who needs presence more than answers. After a long silence, he spoke again. Her name was Leora. We were supposed to get married. She loved wildflowers, always said she hated arranged bouquets, wanted messy beauty, natural, unforced. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I didn't even get her wildflowers. Mireille's voice was quiet. I think she knew you loved her. He shook his head. She knew I wanted control. That's what I offered her. Schedules, security, not space to be messy. Another silence. You know the worst part? He asked. Mireille waited. I keep trying to build things that don't fall apart. But none of it brings her back. There it was. The raw truth. Not from a businessman. Not from a tycoon. But from a man who had no more walls left that night. I'm tired, he admitted. She stepped closer. Then stopped trying to hold the whole world up. Rest. He looked at her. Really looked. It wasn't attraction. Not in that moment. It was recognition of someone who had been through the fire and still stood upright. He set the glass down. I don't want to be alone tonight. Mireille's breath caught, not because she feared what he meant, but because she knew exactly what he didn't. She stepped closer, not to fill a role, not to soothe his grief away, but because somehow she understood the ache he couldn't name. I'll stay, she said. And she did, not in his bed, but beside him, on the old velvet chaise in the corner of the room. He lay on one end, she on the other. Neither spoke. But he slept, and for the first time in days, he didn't wake up screaming. The next morning she made him tea. He took it with quiet gratitude. Neither of them spoke about the night before. Later that day, he left the villa without goodbye. Mireille remained behind, not expecting thanks, but she didn't forget him. How could she? A few weeks later, when her body began to change and the tests confirmed what she already suspected, she sat on the edge of her bed with the window open, letting the silence wrap around her once again. This time, it wasn't peaceful, but it was real. She was pregnant, and she was alone. She had options, agencies she could call, contacts who would handle it, but every part of her recoiled at the thought. These weren't theoretical lives. They were children. Her children, his children. She didn't try to reach him. Why would she? He had barely been himself when they met. That night wasn't about seduction. It wasn't about a secret affair. It was about two broken people sitting in the dark. Would he even remember? Would he want to? What if he accused her of lying? What if he wanted the children but not her? No, she made a decision. She would raise them herself. And she did. Every late-night fever, every tiny milestone, every whispered bedtime story in French, she held them through it all, quietly, fiercely, without him, but never against him. She never poisoned their image of him. She simply said, "Your papa was hurting when we met. Sometimes people can't show up until they heal." She thought that was the end of it. Until the day the money ran low, until the job contracts thinned out, until a friend suggested an elite domestic agency in New York with good pay and discreet policies. She didn't apply using her full name. She didn't plan to be seen. She just needed the job, not realizing fate would place her directly under the roof of the man she'd chosen to protect her children from. Now every moment inside that home was a quiet war she fought within herself, not to lash out, not to cry, not to explain, but to hold, to wait, to watch, and one day, when the time was right, to speak. Present day, the walls of Corwin Hale's penthouse had seen deals worth hundreds of millions, negotiations, celebrations, and power moves. But that night, the quiet inside those walls felt heavier than any contract ever signed. Mireille stood by the large window, arms crossed loosely, watching the lights of the city flicker like distant memories. She had tucked Luca into bed 2 hours earlier, kissed his forehead, and whispered a short prayer over his dreams. But her own mind was restless. She felt him watching her. Corwin stood behind her, in the shadows of the hallway, not speaking, not interrupting. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to ask everything. Who are you, really? Why did you come? Why now? But his questions were selfish, and deep down, he knew it. Mireille turned slightly, sensing him there. Their eyes met, not with tension, not with fear, but with everything left unsaid. He didn't speak, and she didn't offer. The next day, Mireille took Luca to the museum. He loved the dinosaur exhibit, especially the giant skeleton in the atrium. He ran ahead, clutching her hand with excitement, his laughter bouncing off the marble walls. Corwin had sent the driver to trail them discreetly. He hadn't told her. He wasn't ready to admit how protective he had suddenly become. From a distance, he watched her kneel to tie Luca's shoes, her hands steady, her voice low and loving. She didn't just look after him. She saw him. He hadn't realized how rare that was, how rare she was. That night, Mireille sat on her bed with the small notebook she kept hidden under her pillow. She turned to a blank page and began to write. They're growing so fast. Sometimes I forget what I've sacrificed. But then I see them laugh. I see the way they rest when I sing. I see their eyes, his eyes, and I know I made the right choice. Even if it broke something in me to do it. I don't hate him. That's the hardest part. I should, but I don't. I see who he was and who he's still trying not to be. And I wonder, is there still a version of this story where he chooses love? She closed the notebook and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The weight of 5 years sat on her chest like a held breath. It was getting harder to carry. A few days later, while cleaning up Luca's art supplies, Corwin found one of the twins' drawings tucked behind the stack. It was simple, crayon lines, bright colors, 2 children holding hands with a woman in the middle. Maman was written beneath it. He stared at it, pulse quickening. This wasn't Luca's drawing. These weren't his stick figures. The handwriting was different. There were 2 children in the picture, not one. He turned it over. Faintly, almost erased, were initials in the corner, J+A, not L, not Luca. His hand tightened around the paper. He walked into the living room, heart pounding. Mireille was reading a book on the sofa, her posture calm. He held up the drawing. "What is this?" She looked at it, then at him, and said nothing. "You have other children?" A pause. She set the book down. "Yes." He stepped closer. "How old are they?" She didn't blink. 4. His stomach dropped. Everything inside him tightened. "You never told me. You never asked. Are they mine?" The silence stretched long between them. She stood, walked past him, then stopped, turned. "They're yours." It wasn't said with drama, no anger, no theatrics, just truth, a truth she had carried for years. Corwin sat down slowly. His voice came out hoarse. "Why, didn't you come to me?" "I was going to," she said, voice low. "For weeks after I found out. I rehearsed it every night. But when I finally got the courage to do it, you had already returned to the world. The suits, the press, the coldness." She took a breath. "You weren't the man who cried in Tuscany. You were someone else. And I was afraid." "Afraid of me?" "Afraid of what your pride would do to them. You mocked me in your home. Looked right through me. If I had told you that day, would you have listened?" He didn't respond, because they both knew the answer. "I kept them safe," she continued. "Fed them, loved them, sang to them in French, taught them that the world doesn't need to be cruel to be real. And I told them their father was somewhere finding his way." Corwin swallowed hard. He didn't know whether to be furious or ashamed. So he said the only thing he could. "I want to see them." Mireille nodded. "They'll be here tomorrow." That night, Corwin didn't sleep. He sat in his office replaying every moment from the past month, every glance, every answer, every time. She had stood in front of him with her hands full of truth, and he had been too blind to see it. He pulled the old journal from his drawer and read it again. She didn't try to fix it, she just stayed. He closed the book and whispered to no one. She stayed, and then she left. And now she was back, but only for the sake of the children. He had no illusions. Forgiveness wasn't something he could demand. It had to be earned, if she still had space in her heart for that. The next day, Mireille returned with 2 small figures at her side. The girl had his eyebrows, the boy, his eyes. They stood close to her, shy but curious. Mireille knelt and whispered something in French. The children stepped forward. Corwin dropped to one knee. He looked at them, not as a man trying to manage a company or recover lost ground, but as someone who had just been handed 2 entire worlds he didn't know existed. He blinked back tears. I'm your papa," he said, voice cracking. The girl reached out first. Her tiny hand touched his cheek. The boy followed, resting a hand on Corwin's shoulder. Mireille watched, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her coat. She didn't interrupt. She let the moment breathe. Let the truth stand, without judgment, just presence. That evening, after the children were asleep, Corwin sat across from Mireille in the living room. No tension, no scripts, just quiet. "Why did you really come back?" he asked. She looked up. "I didn't want them to grow up asking questions I couldn't answer," she said. "And maybe I hoped you'd changed, even just a little." He exhaled. "I have. I think you'll have to show them," she replied. "And you?" She didn't answer, but her eyes softened. And for Corwin Hale, that softness was more powerful than any yes. Should she have told him sooner? What would you have done? Drop your thoughts below. We read every comment. The next few days passed like slow waves against a shoreline, not crashing but constant, shaping everything quietly. Mireille remained calm, composed, steady. She didn't act as though anything had changed. She cooked breakfast, packed lunches, managed bedtime routines. Her voice remained gentle, her pace measured. But something in Corwin had shifted. He watched her differently now. It wasn't just her kindness with Luca. It was the way she moved through the apartment like she had been there all along. Not as a guest, not as staff, but as something much harder to define. He began noticing her pauses. How she lingered for 1 second longer when the twins asked him questions. How her eyes searched his face when he said their names, as if she was trying to decide if he was ready to receive them fully, not just as facts, but as a father. He wasn't sure if he was. One morning, as he walked past the guest wing, he heard laughter behind a half-closed door. The twins were playing on the carpet, building towers with wooden blocks. Mireille sat cross-legged beside them, hair loosely pulled back, her sweater sleeves pushed up. "Attention, mes chères," she said softly, helping her son reposition a block. "We must be patient if we want it to stand." "Patient," the boy repeated. "Patience is strength," she added, placing her hand over his gently. Corwin stood in the hall, unseen. The words weren't just for the child. He felt them land inside him. That afternoon, he offered to take the children for a short walk. Mireille hesitated, then agreed. It was a small thing, a trip to the corner bookstore, but Corwin approached it like an executive briefing. He rehearsed what to say, how to hold their attention, how not to say the wrong thing. But the children didn't need performance. They needed presence. And Corwin, to his surprise, found that being present didn't require perfection, only willingness. He held their hands at the crosswalk, bought them each a book, carried one of them when they grew tired, and when they returned home, they were still talking about the dragon stories they'd seen. Mireille stood by the door watching them enter. Her smile was small, but it reached her eyes. "You did well," she said. "I was nervous," he admitted. "That's how you know it matters." That evening, Corwin joined them for dinner. They laughed. They made a mess with applesauce. They asked him questions like, "Do you know how to make bubbles with a straw? And why do shoes have tongues?" Mireille simply let the room breathe. But when Corwin excused himself to take a call, he paused by the kitchen, hearing her voice again. This time, quieter. Personal. "You're doing better," she whispered to the twins in French. "He's trying." A silence. "I think he might even love you already." Corwin stood frozen, the words hitting him harder than he expected. Love. Already. Not as a duty, but as a beginning. The next morning, Corwin woke to the sound of laughter. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It was gentle, layered. The kind of laughter children make when they feel safe. He got up and followed the sound into the sunroom. There they were. The twins were sprawled across a blanket, building something with colored paper and glue sticks. Mireille sat beside them, sleeves rolled, hair falling loosely to one side. She wasn't instructing. She was joining them. As he stepped closer, the girl held up a paper crown. "Maman, can Papa wear one too?" Mireille froze for just a second. She didn't correct her. She didn't hide it. She just looked at Corwin, her expression unreadable. But her eyes carried more than she intended. He walked closer. "Papa would be honored," he said. The girl grinned and placed the crown carefully on his head. It tilted slightly to the side. The boy laughed. "It's crooked." "Some things still work even when they're not perfect," Mireille replied. Corwin didn't miss the weight of that line. He sat down with them, legs crossed awkwardly, accepting his crown as if it were a symbol of something deeper. Not royalty, not power, just presence, just trying. Later that evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Corwin found himself in the kitchen again. Mireille was washing dishes, sleeves wet, a tiredness in her movements she couldn't fully disguise. "I can help," he offered. She gave him a quiet glance. "You don't need to." "I want to." She handed him a plate. Their fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. They stood side by side in silence. He finally spoke. "They love you more than words. I've raised them since their first breath." He nodded slowly. "I can see that now." There was a pause. "I should have known," he added. "No, you couldn't have. You weren't ready to see it." Her words weren't an accusation. They were grace. And that stung more than blame ever could. That night, Corwin sat in his study, holding one of the drawings the twins had made. He traced the outline of their stick figures, 2 children, a mother, and now, him. They had added him. He hadn't asked to be included. But they had, without permission, without hesitation, and it terrified him. Because if he accepted it, truly accepted it, he couldn't go back to the life he'd lived before. Not the penthouse silence, not the power games, not the illusion of control. He would have to be a father, a man worthy of being trusted. He looked toward the hallway where Mireille had quietly built a life within his walls without ever asking for permission. And he realized something. She had never needed him. But maybe, just maybe, he needed her, not to fix him, but to remind him he could still choose something real, something permanent. From that moment on, he began listening more, watching more. He noticed how the twins naturally mirrored her gestures, how the boy folded his socks the same way she did, how the girl brushed her hair to the side like Mireille always had. He saw their bond not as a barrier, but as a gift, one that had existed long before he ever knew it. And though he hadn't earned it, they still let him in. They invited him, without fanfare, without demands, just love. And that was the most humbling truth of all. It was nearly 6 p.m. when Mireille's phone rang. She was helping Luca with a puzzle while Corwin read through documents nearby. The ringtone was soft, a custom chime she reserved only for one person, her friend Marie. She excused herself quickly, walking toward the hallway. Corwin didn't pay much attention until he heard her voice shift behind the closed door. Not loud, but urgent. When she returned, her face was pale. "I need to step out for a few hours," she said carefully, avoiding his eyes. Corwin looked up from his file. "Is something wrong?" "My friend, she's unwell. She was watching the children. I need to go." She didn't clarify which children. "Just the children." "I can send the driver," he offered. "No," she said too fast. "I'll take them. Myself." There was a pause, the kind that carried something unspoken. "I won't be gone long." Corwin nodded slowly. Mireille left the apartment without another word, but the silence she left behind was thunderous. The cab ride felt longer than usual. The twins sat beside her, confused but calm. She held their hands tightly, whispering promises they didn't fully understand. "You'll stay close to me," she said. "You'll listen to everything I say, yes?" "Yes, Maman," they replied in unison. She kissed their heads and blinked back the fear swelling in her chest. She had worked so hard to keep their worlds separate, to keep them safe. But now, the walls were closing in. She had no choice. Tonight, everything would be exposed. Corwin had just poured himself a drink when the elevator pinged again. He wasn't expecting anyone. When the doors opened, his breath caught. Mireille stepped inside the foyer, but she wasn't alone. A boy and a girl held her hands tightly. Both had dark eyes, familiar eyes, the same shape, the same intensity. His eyes. Everything in him froze. Mireille moved forward slowly, as if her steps themselves carried weight. The children looked around, unsure, but not afraid. They trusted her, completely. Corwin stood rooted, unable to speak. "What is this?" he asked. "They're mine," she replied softly. Then, after a pause, "They're yours." The air between them split wide. For the first time in his life, Corwin Hale didn't have a word to respond. Corwin stared at them. The boy looked up first, tugging gently at Mireille's sleeve. The girl clung to her side, eyes scanning the vast apartment. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. He could feel it. Something ancient and instinctive inside him recognized them. Same chin, same mouth, same serious gaze that held too much awareness for their age. He took a breath, shallow and sharp. "I don't understand," he said finally. "Why now?" Mireille's voice didn't tremble. "Because I didn't have a choice. You had 5 years. I had 5 years of protecting them from this. From me." "Yes." The word landed like a slap, but she didn't raise her voice. Corwin's jaw tightened. "You came into my home, worked under my roof, said nothing. You mocked me the first day I walked in," she replied. "Do you think that gave me confidence to tell you they were yours?" His silence wasn't an answer, but it was honest. "I didn't even recognize you," he muttered. "I know. Why didn't you?" "Because you weren't ready to hear it, and I wasn't ready to beg." Mireille stepped forward just slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "I loved them enough to carry the truth without throwing it at your feet like a demand. You had to be ready to receive it. And now I am. You saw them. You knew. Before I said a word." Corwin looked down at the children again. They stared at him with gentle curiosity, but no fear, because they had her, and she had never let them feel abandoned. He turned away, walking toward the far window like he could escape the weight of it all. But it followed him. The stillness, the revelation, the quiet dignity of a woman who had just broken open his carefully constructed world with 5 words. "They're yours." He ran a hand through his hair. "This is a lot. I know. You should have told me. I'm telling you now. That doesn't change the fact. I wasn't going to put them in the hands of a man who couldn't see beyond his own pain." He turned sharply. "And what if I could have changed? But you didn't. You mocked me. You ignored your own nephew. You couldn't stand the idea of someone stepping into your space. Mireille's voice never rose. That made it worse. It stripped him of the defense he had left. You weren't a safe place back then, she said, and I wasn't going to risk exposing two small hearts to a man still running from his own. Her eyes were wet now, but no tears fell. I'm not angry, Corwin, she added. I'm tired. He walked toward the foyer slowly, eyes fixed on the floor. What are their names? He asked quietly. She looked at him. Julien, Amélie. He nodded, slowly, the names carving themselves into the walls of his chest. He knelt down, his voice breaking. Julien. Amélie. The girl tilted her head. Do you live here too? Yes, he said. I do. Are you sad? He forced a small smile. A little. Julien took one step closer. Do you want to sit with us? Corwin looked at Mireille. She nodded once. He sat down slowly, the children pressing close. Not because they were told to, because children feel truth, and something inside them had already started to trust it. The morning after Mireille's reveal, the penthouse was quiet. Not the usual quiet Corwin had cultivated, but an unfamiliar one. The kind that comes when someone has taken their light with them. The children were gone. So was Mireille. She hadn't stormed out. She hadn't slammed a door. She had simply packed a single bag and left a note. They need space. So do you. We'll be safe. When you're ready, truly ready, you'll know where to find us. Corwin read it once, then again. The third time, he didn't finish. He folded the note, placed it in his jacket pocket, and stared at the untouched breakfast Mireille had made the day before. He didn't eat. He didn't speak. And when his assistant called to remind him of the quarterly board meeting, he answered with 2 words. Reschedule everything. The empire didn't break in one day. It cracked, slowly but visibly. Corwin missed 2 important investor calls. A partner withdrew from a joint development project after concerns about Hale's recent inconsistency. The press speculated. Was the real estate mogul slipping? Was the man who had once commanded headlines losing his edge? He didn't respond to the speculation, because he barely noticed it. His days were spent replaying memories that had once seemed irrelevant. A girl asking, "Are you sad?" A boy asking, "Do you want to sit with us?" And Mireille, not angry, not begging, just gone. Her absence felt like the lights had been dimmed in his life, not completely off, but enough to see the shadows. He began walking more. No driver, no calls, just silence and streets. He found himself outside a bookstore one afternoon, staring through the glass like a stranger. There was a mother inside, kneeling with her son. He held a book about space. She smiled as he pointed at the stars. Corwin blinked. In another life, that might have been Mireille and Julien, or Amélie asking why moons don't fall from the sky. He stepped back and kept walking. At work, his staff tried to hide their concern. He arrived late, left early, sat in meetings without speaking. He didn't yell. He didn't micromanage. He simply withdrew. Even Ilaria, who had once warned him, began to worry. You're chasing ghosts, she told him one day. They aren't ghosts, he replied. They're real. She leaned forward. Then go find them. He looked away. I don't know how. A week later, Corwin was driving himself along the Hudson. He hadn't driven in months, maybe years. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't distracted. He was just thinking, which, for a man like him, was often more dangerous than speeding. He didn't see the other driver run the red light, didn't hear the brakes until the tires were already shrieking. The crash wasn't fatal, but it was violent. The airbag hit him hard. The glass cracked. The car spun once, and then stillness. A different kind of silence this time, one that didn't ask him to reflect. It demanded it. The hospital ceiling was blank, white, too bright. Corwin opened his eyes slowly, wincing at the tightness in his chest and the stiffness in his arm. A nurse stood nearby, adjusting something on a monitor. You're lucky, she said. Could have been much worse. He didn't reply. He just turned his head toward the window. Outside, the world carried on. Cars moved. People crossed the street. No headlines, no press, just movement. The nurse checked his vitals. You have someone to call? He shook his head. No, he whispered. The word hurt more than the bruises. He spent 3 days recovering. Ilaria visited once. She didn't scold. She sat beside his bed and held his hand. "I know what this feels like," she said gently. "No, you don't." "I do. Not the crash, the emptiness." She squeezed his fingers. "You've been building walls for years. But walls don't keep pain out. They just keep love from getting in." He closed his eyes. "I let them walk out." "No," she said. "You let them live freely. You let her choose safety. That's not failure. That's her knowing who she was dealing with." She paused. "But now that you know who you are, you can choose who you'll become." When she left, she placed the note Mireille had written on the nightstand. "We'll be safe. When you're ready, truly ready, you'll know where to find us." Corwin was discharged on a Friday. He returned to the penthouse. It was clean, polished, empty. He stood in the foyer with his keys in hand, staring at the space where Mireille had once stood with the twins. He walked to the kitchen. No paper crowns, no drawings on the fridge, just stainless steel and silence. He opened the closet, took out the box with Leora's photos. He placed it on the table. Then, he took out a smaller envelope, one that held the most recent drawings the twins had made. He spread them out side by side and stared at them, the past, the present, all laid out in front of him, not in conflict, but in conversation. He sat down, and, for the first time in years, he cried, not for Leora, not for lost time, but for the version of himself he'd refused to become. Until now, he called his assistant the next morning. "Sell the Montclair development," he said. "Sir, you heard me." He paused, "and begin the process of restructuring Hale Dominion. I'll step back from operations, start the paperwork." There was silence on the other end. "Understood." Corwin hung up, then packed a bag. Not suits, not contracts, just what mattered. He booked a train, not a jet, and headed north, toward Vermont. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find yourself. If you've ever had a wake-up call that changed your life, share it with us. We read every comment. The train pulled into the small Vermont town just after noon. Corwin stepped onto the platform with a single bag slung over his shoulder, dressed in jeans, a plain jacket, and shoes that had never touched snow before. No driver, no assistant trailing behind, just him. The cold bit at his hands, but he didn't mind. It grounded him. The town was quiet, modest, the kind of place people didn't pass through. They stayed, not because of opportunity, but because it felt enough. He stopped at a corner bakery for directions. A teenager behind the counter recognized his name, but didn't react with awe. "Library's just 2 blocks that way," she said, pointing with a gloved hand. "She reads to the kids every Thursday." Corwin nodded. "Thank you." He didn't walk fast, not out of hesitation, but reverence. He hadn't earned a sprint. He approached the library slowly, the red brick building standing like a memory he hadn't made yet. Inside, children's voices spilled through the glass doors in soft waves. He could hear laughter, page-turning, a woman's voice reading a line from a fairy tale. His breath caught. He stepped inside. The children were gathered on a circular rug, some leaning against beanbags, others sprawled on the floor. Mireille sat in the center, holding a large hardcover book. She wore a soft green sweater, hair tucked loosely behind her ears, her voice calm and melodic. Julien sat to her right, Amélie to her left, both listening, completely still. She didn't see him at first. He stayed by the entrance, frozen, unsure of how to interrupt a piece he hadn't created. Then, Amélie noticed. Her eyes lit up. She leaned into Mireille and whispered something. Mireille turned. Their eyes met. The story stopped. Silence. But it wasn't cold. It was full. He took a step forward. "I didn't bring flowers," Corwin said. "I never liked flowers," she replied softly. Another step. "I didn't come to fix what I broke. I didn't ask you to. I came because they deserve a father." Mireille closed the book gently. "And what about me?" Corwin swallowed. "I came because I'm still learning how to be the man you saw that night in Tuscany." The room stayed quiet. The children waited. So did the words. "I don't want forgiveness handed to me," he added. "I want to grow into someone who earns it." Julien stood slowly and walked toward him. Corwin knelt down. The boy placed his small hand on his father's chest. "Are you better now?" he asked. Corwin's throat tightened. I'm trying, he said. Amelie followed, her hands behind her back. You smell different, she said. Mireille laughed softly behind them. He used to wear something sharper. Cologne, Corwin offered. I left it behind. Good, Amelie said. Then she hugged him, and Julian joined. Mireille stood slowly, arms crossed, but her eyes shone. You sold your company? She asked. Most of it, he said. Kept enough to live. Gave the rest away. To start over? To build something quieter. She stepped forward, close enough to hear him breathe. There's no grand speech? She asked. No, just me. She looked at him a long time. And then she nodded. Okay. That night, he didn't stay at a hotel. He stayed in a guest room down the hall from the twins. It wasn't lavish, just clean sheets, a window that let in the sound of wind. He helped Julian with his puzzle, braided Amelie's hair for the first time. It took too long. She said he tried too hard. He smiled. Over dinner they talked about school, fairy tales, pine trees, not the past, not yet. But the silence had changed. It no longer asked, why didn't you? It asked, what will you do now? After the kids fell asleep, Mireille made tea. They sat by the fireplace, not facing each other, just near enough. He looked into the flames. I should have come back sooner. You came when you were ready, she said. He turned toward her. Do you still believe in that version of me? She didn't answer right away, but she poured him tea and stayed. A year passed. Seasons came and went in Vermont the way they always had, quietly, predictably. But inside one small home on a corner street, something unpredictable had taken root. Growth. It didn't happen all at once. Corwin didn't become the perfect father overnight. He forgot dentist appointments, overcooked pancakes, took too long folding laundry, but he showed up. Every morning, every night. And that mattered more than anything. He built a smaller home, not because he had to, because he wanted something built with his own hands, not hired ones. A home with just enough space for bedtime stories, muddy shoes, laughter, through walls, and the scent of soup simmering on slow weekends. It had a porch with a crooked swing Julian loved and a tree Amelie called hers. They planted flowers in the yard, wild ones. Mireille's quiet smile the day they bloomed said more than any thank you ever could. They co-parented at first. Schedules, boundaries, clear lines. But those lines blurred with time. Not in chaos, in comfort. She stayed for dinners. He walked him to school. They hosted birthdays together, wrapping presents side by side, laughing when the tape got stuck. And slowly, Mireille softened. Corwin didn't rush her. He never asked for more than she could offer. He let her lead. He let the children lead. And eventually, they all stopped counting the days since the return and started counting things like first family hike, first snowball fight, first I love you spoken aloud from one of the twins before bedtime. It wasn't a beginning. It wasn't a happy ending. It was just real. Corwin joined the town's weekend volunteer group. No one cared who he used to be. They cared that he showed up on time, that he carried firewood, that he didn't act like he was above anyone. That humility suited him far better than any tailored suit ever had. He kept a photo of Leora on a shelf in his new office, not as a weight, as a reminder. She was part of his story. So was his failure. But neither defined his ending. Only his choices could do that. Mireille never lost her edge. She still moved with purpose, still protected her children with every fiber of her being. But something had shifted. She no longer had to brace herself. She no longer carried the full load alone. And when she looked at Corwin now, it wasn't through the lens of what he had failed to be. It was through the lens of who he became. They never announced that they were together. There was no label, just love and patience, and a rhythm they learned one small moment at a time. One afternoon, as the children played in the yard, Corwin brought Mireille a cup of tea. She sipped, then looked out the window at Julian and Amelie drawing with chalk on the path. They're happy, she said. They're whole, he replied. She looked at him. And you? He paused. I'm finally present. She nodded once. You were always capable of it, she said. You just needed to remember who you were before the world told you who to become. He took her hand. No speeches, no begging, just presence, and she didn't pull away. That night, Corwin stood in the doorway of the twins' room, watching them sleep. Julian's hand dangled off the bed, Amelie's blanket pushed to the side. He covered them both gently, then stepped out. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He just knew he'd be there for it, fully, completely, without pride, without pretending. Just love, the kind you live, the kind you choose, over and over again. If this story moved you, give it a like, share with someone who believes in second chances, and hit subscribe so you don't miss our next story.